Welcome back to Watershed Wise Landscape Professional Certification. This is Module 5, Irrigation Scheduling, the first part of Irrigation Scheduling, which is going to focus mostly on soil water. So these next two modules kind of go hand in glove, but there's so much content that we decided to break them into two separate sections. So we will start with Irrigation Scheduling. Yay! Now that we've talked about how much water a plant is actually taking out of the soil on a daily basis, we can begin to figure out, well, when do we actually have to apply that water back into the landscape to keep the plant growing, optimally irrigating? And that takes us now away from the plant, really. They're doing their thing, evapotranspiring. But now we want to concentrate on how much water is actually in the soil. And so this is going to require that we take snapshots in time to determine how much water is there at a particular time. And the first thing that we have to do is we have to determine what kind of soil do we have. And the way you do that, the best way in the field anyway, is with a hand test for soil. So we recommend that you download that information from the course. It's just a really quick little sheet that will help you to determine use the hand test for soil. And that will help you to determine whether you have sand, silt, or clay. Now, here's the thing. We are only going to be talking about soil type or soil texture, as it's sometimes called. It's kind of old school, because we know now that soil structure is really where it's all at. But for irrigation, all we care about is the soil type or the texture. And the soil type determines the water holding capacity, the innate water holding capacity of the particular soil. Now, when I first started studying soil and irrigation, this graph, this is the chart that you see, and it was always about sand, silt, or clay being like basketball. Sand was like basketballs and clay was like marbles, and I was always like, what are we talking about? So here at G3, we like to relate it to food. It makes it a little easier for us. So I want you to think about sand. We're going to talk about the properties of sand. Sand is like an iced coffee. The iced coffee, it has these giant ice cubes in the container. When you pour the coffee in, it goes in really fast and fills the glass. If you drilled a hole in the bottom of the glass, it would drain out super fast because there's no adhesion, with the, or I guess it's cohesion actually, between the soil and the soil, between the ice cubes and the coffee. If you stuck a straw into this glass and acted like a plant and tried to suck out just the coffee, it would be very easy to do, because again, it isn't, the particles are not holding on to the coffee very well. Clay is totally different. Clay is more like having a glass of an iced blended coffee. So you, first of all, the ice is like these shards, very, very small, lots of surface areas. And the coffee and the ice are very tightly bound together. It's difficult to separate the coffee from the ice in a blended coffee. When you try to fill a glass with the coffee, very difficult to do. It is very slow. Like getting it in, it glops together. It's hard to get that coffee into a glass. Even if the glass was just filled with the ice shards and you had to pour the coffee in, you would find it would go a lot slower than it would in a glass filled with the ice cubes of sand, that are like sand. So in the clay soil or the ice blended coffee, if you drill a hole in the bottom, the coffee drips out very, very, very slowly because those shards are holding on to the coffee. And if you put a straw in and acted like a plant, it would be very difficult for you to separate the coffee from the ice. And so that is how clay behaves. It's very difficult to separate the water from the particles. It's slow to intake water, It's slow to release water. Totally opposite is sand, where it's very easy to put water in. The water runs through the system very, very quickly. And it's also easier for the plant to extract the water out of the sand. So that's a great way of thinking about soil type. Now, what we really want to try to figure out is how much water is available to plants. And you know what? I want to just take a second, because I'm looking also at the book at the same time. And I'm realizing there's something that we didn't talk about right at the beginning, but it's worth mentioning again before we talk about how much water is available to plants. And that is, why do we irrigate? Like, what's the purpose? We taught in Module 4, we talked about plant water requirement. That's how much water the plants were essentially removing from the soil. But we didn't really talk about, why do we have to irrigate? And so basically, the question of irrigation scheduling comes down to first of all, how much water are we going to have to put into the soil for the plant? And also, how long is going to be the time between the events that we apply the water to the plant, and how much time is required to run the irrigation system to apply the water that we want to apply when we're ready to apply. So it's a quantity of water and a time issue. These are the two things really that we're going to be talking about here. And again, inches of water always, not gallons, except when we talk about precipitation rate. But in general, scheduling is all about inches of water. And then time is usually days, for days between events, and then minutes of how long the irrigation has to run. Okay, so now back to our program. So how much water is available to plants? Well, in the soil, and that really depends on a bunch of things. So first of all, what kind of soil is it? Because the water holding capacity of a particular soil type is different. How deep are the roots of the plant? That makes a difference, because the root depth is essentially creating the what I'm going to call a container, basically, because the plant can extract water from the soil only where its roots are. So more roots, deeper roots, better extraction. And in the case of irrigation, we are really not so much talking about abundance of roots, but rather the depth of the roots. How deep into the soil can they access water? Also, how much water is available is going to depend on how much water the plant has taken out of the soil at any given time. So that's plant water requirement, daily plant water requirement. And there are going to be some other microclimate factors that come into account, like, for example, what is the water source? Are you using gray water? Are you using potable water? And then, is it only available at certain times? And then also, what is the quality of the water? That would also have an impact. We're not going to talk so much about the water quality. We're assuming that we're irrigating with potable water for the most part in this session. But that is something to just keep in the back of your mind. Okay, so there are three states basically of water in soil at any given time. And the first one is what's called saturation. So saturation happens right after the water is applied to the soil. It's that moment that it's applied to the soil and it has filled up all the pore space in the soil. And so it's taken away all the oxygen in the soil. It's now filled with water. It's an instant. And immediately, as gravity and capillary action are working on that water, it begins to drain away and out of the soil. And so the moment that there becomes a 50-50 balance, essentially, a good balance. It's not actually 50-50. It's a good balance, and it defined as a percentage, so we should be careful about that. But a good balance of oxygen and water in the soil, that is called field capacity. So field capacity is like our starting position for irrigation. It's the place where everything is perfect for the growth of the plant. And then we have something called wilting point, or sometimes called permanent wilting point. The wilting point is when so much water has either drained out of the soil or has been extracted from the soil by the plant that the available water in the soil is no longer available to the plant. There may be water in that soil, but it's really just a very small film that is attached so strongly to the particles in the soil that the plant can't overcome that bond. And so it effectively, it's not there's no water in the soil. It's there's no available water in the soil for the plant. And that's wilting point. So somewhere along this continuum from saturation to wilting point, we are going to want to apply water through an irrigation system to the landscape to reestablish a field capacity. So we need to determine how much water actually, how many inches of water are actually available to the plant in the soil. And as I said, this is determined by the soil type or texture. And there's a chart that you have in your course material that will allow you to determine this information. And I'm going to work with it over the next couple of minutes to help you to understand, how to use the chart. So first of all, this available water holding capacity chart is by soil type is organized by these different soil types going from very sandy at the top of the chart down to organic soils, which we're going to talk about later, but organic soils, which are like peat soils. So that's probably not that's probably not happening unless, I mean, maybe it is for you, but probably not. So we're somewhere in between sandy soil and clay soil. And then as you move across into the second column, what you see is available moisture range inches per foot. Now, I want you to think about that. The chart is set up in inches of water per foot of soil. So remember, I told you that in irrigation, we're not really thinking we are. So we're talking about inches of water in the soil profile, and it's inches everywhere. It's like rain. When you talk to somebody and say, "Oh yeah, it rained 3 inches," do you say it rained 3 inches per square foot, or it rained 3 inches? You don't say it any other way. You say it rained 3 inches. That means it rained 3 inches everywhere, right? Everywhere, 3 inches. Okay, it's the same when we talk about ET, and it's the same when we talk about inches of water in soil. It's just inches. So, or feet in this case. So the available moisture range is the inches of water per foot of soil. And you can see that there's a range. So for sandy soils, I'm trying to get my annotation here. Here we go. Okay. So for sandy soils, right, coarse soils, you can see that there is a range from 0.50 to 1.25. So there's half an inch, 0.50 inches of water per foot of sandy soil. And that is a range because if you have a loamy sand soil, you would have 1.25 inches of water per foot of loamy sand soil. It's always fine to use, unless you're given otherwise, to use the middle of the chart. So this is the average over here. You can always use that number to determine, unless you're asked very, very specifically to differentiate between a particular type of soil. But in general, you can use this average number for all of the very coarse soils. Just like for the clay soils down here, you can use the 2.10 inches of water per foot of clay soil. Perfectly fine for doing your calculations. Excuse me. So here's the deal. It's always expressed in inches per foot, but it's unusable to us in inches per foot. We are going to need inches per inch. So when you get a number that says available water holding capacity, look to see what the units are. Make sure that it has either already been converted to inches per inch of soil. And if it hasn't, if it still is in inches per foot, divide it by 12 to come up with inches per inch. So just to do a quick example of that, here we have oh, sorry, let's actually go to this one here. So we have 2.5 inches of water per foot of clay soil. If we divide by 12, we find out that we have 0.21 inches of water per inch of clay soil. So divide by 12 when you see this, if it isn't already converted. So just check to make sure. Sorry. So here's a question. Oh, yeah. So here's a question that we can go through very easily. So we just converted this on the previous slide. We figured out that in an inch of clay soil, we have 0.21 inches of water. And now the question is, what about sandy loam? Right? So if we went to sandy loam soil, which is up here, annotation so we can go. So sandy loam is right here. Okay, how many inches of water are in the sandy loam soil? How many inches are in an inch? Well, it's going to be 1.5 divided by 12. Okay, now we've determined how much water is in an inch of sandy loam soil. Take it to the next level. How much water is in 3 inches of sandy loam soil? Well, we would multiply that by 3. And that would tell us how much water was in a 3-inch depth of sandy loam soil. So that's the answer to the first one, which is how many inches are in an inch of clay. And here we have the sandy loam soil. We take the 1.5 inches per foot, we divide by 12 inches per foot, and we come up with a number, and we multiply that by 3, and we realize that it is 0.375 inches of water per inch of soil for sandy, sandy loam. Okay, so that's the thing. It's not that for some other kind of soil, it's just for sandy loam. In 3 inches, we have 0.375 inches of water. So that's using the available water holding capacity chart. Now, it's a pretty easy leap to get to see how this answers the question, how much water is available to our plants in any given place? Because we just figured out how much water is available in an inch of a particular soil type. Now, all we really need to know is what is the root depth of the plants? So this is called the plant available water. And that is another acronym, PAW, plant available water. It's the amount of water in a particular soil type that is available to the plant in a snapshot. So don't forget, it's a snapshot in time. And what we do is we take the available water holding capacity of the particular soil per inch of soil, and we multiply that by the inches of root depth. And that gives us the plant available water. If you just listen to the name of the acronym, it describes it. It's the water in the container that is available to your plant available water. It's water holding capacity times root depth in inches. How do we determine root depth? Well, we could use a soil probe to figure out where the roots are. We can read nursery information, which might give us a clue about it. It might say deep rooted or something like that, which could help us to figure it out. If we have just planted the plant, let's say, we would know, it would be the depth of the container. If it was established, we could probably make a good guess about how deep these roots go because we have experience with that plant, or we can, read literature on the plant. So determining root depth is a little bit of art. Soil, when we're talking about, a plant like turf grass, it's pretty easy. You stick your soil probe in. But when we talk about other plants, yeah, it gets a little bit of a challenge. Soil probe is probably the best way to go. Excuse me. One of the things to consider is the effect of compaction on the site. And again, irrigation doesn't really take this into account, but I think it's worthwhile for us to remember that if the site is compacted, the root depth isn't going to be very big. So maybe this is an argument for why we want to create living soil. We have much better root depth in uncompacted soil. All right, so let's just do a couple of plant available water calculations so that you're really comfortable with it. If you have a situation where you have a silt loam and a soil with a root depth of 8 inches, how much water is available to that plant? Plant available water. Well, plant available water is the available water holding capacity of the soil from the chart converted to inches times the plant root depth in inches. So we find out that loamy soil has 1.90 inches of water per foot of soil. To convert it into inches of soil, we just divide by 12. And that tells us that we have 0.158 inches of water per inch of loamy soil. Now we know that we have an 8-inch root depth plant. We multiply 0.158 by 8 inches, and that tells us that we have 1.27 inches of water available to our plant in this garden, in this place, right? So 1.27 inches is our plant available water in 8 inches of soil. Just like, remember, this is describing the container. So now we know how much water is available to a plant in the soil. Okay, cool. That's how big the soil, sometimes we call this the soil moisture reservoir. Okay, that's actually a good description. Plant available water, soil moisture reservoir. Now we're going to ask ourselves, how much of the water are we going to allow this plant to evapotranspire out of the container? Like, this is going to help us determine when we're going to irrigate. So, every day that plant is taking plant water requirement, daily plant water requirement out of the container, and that container is becoming depleted. And at some point, the plant is going to get stressed, not wilting point, but sometime soon, that plant is going to get stressed out. When does the plant get stressed out? How do we keep it from getting stressed out? Because we want this plant to be growing optimally. We want it to have enough water to continue to grow and not have to go through a cycle of stress necessarily. So this is really a kind of, there are rules, irrigation rules, but then there's also art. and it really comes down to kind of, you're thinking about how you want to manage the landscape as to how much water you're going to allow to evapotranspire. If you imagine that the water in the soil at field capacity is like having a full gas tank, you've filled it all up, and now you've driven, and eventually you're on empty, and that is wilting point. Somewhere between full and empty, you're going to want to put gas back in your tank. Assuming you have an internal combustion engine. So when you do it. You know, are you one of those people who fills up the tank and then drives around the block and then fills it up again? Yeah. Or are you one of those people who fills up the tank and then, you know, it gets around half depleted and you're like, okay, time to fill up. So, you know, you make it to a station and you fill up. Or are you one of those people who fills it up and then drives until that thing is, you know, it's on empty and you know just how many days it's going to be on empty before it truly is empty. And then you fill it up. You know, you're somewhere in that spectrum. And it's the same for irrigation. The question is, are we going to be one of those managers that is applying water, you know, as you know, on a ritual because we think it's the right amount, whether we're, you know, driving or not, so to speak, whether we're evapotranspiring or not. So, you know, every 3 days we apply water, or you know, it's more like we want to keep that tank full. Or do we let half of the water out of the tank, the soil moisture reservoir, before we irrigate and fill it up? Or are we stressing? Are we allowing that water to go all the way, you know, down to something lower than half, and then filling up the soil moisture reservoir? Where are we? Well, the role of irrigation is basically to maintain plant available water. Now, we figured out how big the container is and how much water is available to that plant. And now we just have to figure out the timing of when we're going to apply it and how much we're going to allow to be depleted. And so we call this process managing the allowable depletion. We are allowing some amount of water to be depleted from our plant available water or from our soil moisture reservoir. We're allowing water to be depleted. And we have to determine, you know, when are we going to actually, you know, when are we going to stop allowing that water to be depleted? The industry standard for what's called managed allowed depletion percentage, so MAD, managed allowed depletion, the industry percentage is 50%. Basically saying, okay, the plant is evapotranspiring every day. When 50% of the plant available water is gone, we will allow 50% of the water to be depleted. 50% is our managed allowed depletion percentage. We will fill up that reservoir again with water. So managed allowed depletion for the industry standard in irrigation is 50%. And once we know what our percentage of allowable depletion is, our managed allowed depletion percentage, it's pretty straightforward to calculate how much water in inches we're going to allow to come out of the reservoir. So the reservoir is the plant available water, inches, that's in inches. We are then going to multiply that by our managed allowed depletion percentage. So we're going to say 50% of that plant available water we are going to allow to deplete. And that is how we calculate our AD, or allowable depletion. So in this example, we have plant available water of 1.25 inches. We have a MAD, or managed allowed depletion, of 50%. We multiply 1.25 times the 50%, and we get 0.625 inches. We are going to allow 0.625 inches of water to be depleted from the soil before we irrigate again. That's allowable depletion. Now, MAD is not fixed. It is, as I said, it's a little bit of an art. Most of the time, for ease of transaction, we utilize 50%. But it could change. And I want you to think about this because this is definitely a part of irrigation management. If you have, so you can utilize your managed allowed depletion to either, I don't want to really say stress, but to accommodate different situations, like you have a really established garden with incredibly deep roots, right? does allowable depletion have to be at 50%? Or, could it be something else? You have a brand new garden that you just installed and all the roots are really teeny tiny. Is your allowable depletion going to be 50%? Because that might really stress new plants. So I want to walk through a couple of different scenarios and how you would adjust the MAD, the percentage, based on those scenarios. The first one is going to be establishment. So in an establishment situation, as I said, you have short, small roots. The plants are just getting acclimated. And actually, this is a really big deal in establishment. The plants are probably in their container soil, and their container soil is likely to be a different texture than the soil in the surrounding landscape. And that's because container soil is designed because the plants are being irrigated almost every day in the nursery, and they need to be shipped. So the mixture is often lighter than than the surrounding mixture. So or surrounding soil. So it's kind of a different condition when you've just planted that plant. So you're going to be conscious of making sure that those roots don't dry out, right? And if you were to stick with this 50% mark, it's very possible that it would end up drying out a lot quicker, especially if you're planting during a hot season, because then evapotranspiration is at its highest. So in those cases, you may want to adjust your MAD down. In other words, instead of 50%, you're only going to allow 30% of the water to be depleted. So the depletion, the allowable depletion is going to get smaller. If you had a plant available water of 3 inches, and normally, if you use the 50%, you would allow 1.5 inches to go out of the soil, or 50% of it. Now, instead, you go down to like 30%. You would, instead of 50, that means you would only allow 1 inch of water to be depleted from the soil before you irrigate it again. Okay, so establishment adjusts the MAD, the percentage, down so that the allowable depletion is less allowable depletion. Because remember, allowable depletion is the amount you're taking out of the soil. Likewise, you could have a very mature garden. And in a very mature garden, you might not want to, you might want to really reduce the number of times that you irrigate, or the amount that you irrigate. These have very deep roots. They're not going to be easily stressed. They have a huge soil moisture reservoir. And this is a case for, and you probably heard it before, that, in a mature garden, maybe you don't need to irrigate at all. Well, if you do need to irrigate, one of the things that you can do is you can adjust your MAD to be higher. So you make your allowable depletion, 70%, or maybe even more, but let's say 70%. And then what that does is it increases the allowable depletion in inches. So if you just think about it, it's going to take that plant a longer period of time to, you're going to allow that plant a longer period of time to evapotranspire before you're replacing water into the soil moisture reservoir. So for maturity, you're going to increase the allowable depletion percentage and increase the amount of water that you are allowing to deplete from the soil, because the plants have a huge soil moisture reservoir. If you have clay soils, it's a little bit of a different twist. You might not have thought about this before, but in a clay soil, remember, it's very difficult to put water into a clay soil. So even though the clay soil holds on to more water, for the plant, and also it's difficult for the plant to extract water from clay soil. So sometimes when we have clay soils, we think about adjusting our MAD lower so that we are actually irrigating more frequently for smaller amounts, right? Because we're going to allow a smaller amount of water to be depleted from the soil. And we do that by adjusting our MAD percentage down. And so we allow this small amount of water to be depleted, which gives us an opportunity to apply water. We end up essentially applying water more frequently, but it's a very small amount that we're applying more frequently. And this often helps to overcome the clay soil situation of having, that very strong bond of water to soil that's difficult for the plant to overcome. Now, let me just say, soil texture blows all this stuff up. But for now, we're talking about irrigation scheduling, and we're sticking with the irrigation industry protocols, and texture is the only thing that matters. So let's just review very quickly what we need to do in order to determine allowable depletion. First, we look up our soil type, hand test for soil. What do we have? Then we look onto the chart for available water holding capacity by soil type, and we determine the number of inches of water per foot of our soil type. We need it in inches per inch, so we convert it by dividing by 12. And that tells us how many inches of water per inch of soil. Then we figure out the root depth of the plant. We use a soil probe or whatever to determine the root depths of our plant. And we calculate the plant available water, which is just the available water holding capacity in inches per inch for our soil times the root depth of the plant. That gives us the plant available water, soil moisture reservoir, container of water, lots of ways to describe it, but plant available water in this snapshot in time. Now, we need to think about how long are we going to go to before we need to irrigate. Like, how much water are we going to allow to come out of that soil? And the first thing we think of is what percentage of the water are we going to allow to come out? So if we use the industry standard of 50%, that becomes our managed allowed depletion. Managed allowed depletion is a percentage. We apply that percentage to the amount of water we have in the soil. So our plant available water, this much, we apply a percentage of how much we're going to allow to deplete. And that is going to tell us, by multiplying those two together, that's going to give us the allowable depletion in inches. That's the amount of water that we are allowing to come out of the soil in inches. So when does the plant actually require this allowable depletion to be put back in? Well, since we know what the daily plant water requirement is, we know how much this plant is evapotranspiring every day, we can determine how many days it's going to take for that plant to take the allowable depletion out of the soil. And the way that we do that is we divide the allowable depletion inches by the daily plant water requirement inches. And that gives us the irrigation interval, or the interval. So irrigation interval is the number of days between, calculated number of days between irrigation events based on the amount of water that we are allowing to deplete from the soil through daily evapotranspiration. So if we do a quick example and we ask ourselves, what is the interval? And by the way, it's interval days. It's always in days. So we ask ourselves, what is the interval if we have an allowable depletion of 0.625 inches and we have a daily plant water requirement of 0.125 inches? What do? Well, we take our allowable depletion of 0.625 and we divide it by our daily plant water requirement of 0.125. And what do we find out? It's 5 days. 5 days is our irrigation interval. Now, before I end, what happens if you calculate it and it turns into 5.05 days? or 5.3 days. What do you do? Well, again, most of us, we round down to the whole number, right? If it was 5.3. But the answer in irrigation is you always round up. It's the only time I'm ever going to recommend that to you. Round up. You round up with your irrigation interval days. So no matter what it is, if it's some amount other than a whole number in your calculation, and it almost always is, you round up to the next day. Okay. So if this didn't divide evenly, those tricky people who put this together, if this turned into, it was 5.4 days, then you would round up to 6 days. Your irrigation interval would be 6 days, not 5. That is the first part of irrigation scheduling.